If you've primarily read fiction your entire life, then I understand that reading nonfiction can seem kind of daunting. I mean, the idea of reading nonfiction might seem like just cracking open a textbook. How can reading a historical analysis on anything be fun? What topic could you possibly want to know that much about? That's how I thought for a very long time. Up until 2023, I'd only ever read one nonfiction book, and it was just because the author had the same name as me, so I thought it would be funny if I read a book that had my name on it. But as I've gotten to read a lot more nonfiction over the last 2 years, I've come to learn just how much school kind of ruined my perception as to how good nonfiction can be. So I'm going to give you my reasons as to not only why you should read nonfiction, but why very often reading nonfiction might actually be better. Number 1, nonfiction doesn't have to get me invested in the world of the book for me to enjoy it. I'm already invested. It's the world. I already care. Fiction has a bit of an uphill battle because it has to make me care about a world of characters that do not exist and that I've never heard of before. Now, if it succeeds, reading fiction can become this wonderfully immersive experience. It's really difficult to replicate almost anywhere else. But if it doesn't, then I'll just be bored to tears reading about characters that I couldn't care less about. For nonfiction, I'll pretty much always care. Even if I'm just reading a memoir written by someone I've never heard of before, it's still, at the very least, a real-life human being who I'm going to care about more than just some writer's made-up protagonist. Number 2, even when nonfiction's bad, at the very least, I'm still learning something. But when fiction's bad, it's just bad. I'm just waiting for the book to be over for me to summon up enough courage to put it down. It's very rare for me to feel like I'm gaining nothing from nonfiction, unless I'm reading like a really poorly written memoir or someone I vehemently disagree with, but even in those instances, I'm seeing someone else's point of view that I hadn't before, or learning about a perspective that I was previously unaware of. By and large, there's always something I feel I can get out of reading nonfiction, whereas fiction is entirely dependent on my enjoyment. If I don't like what I'm reading, there's very little else to gain. Number 3, I think nonfiction's actually a lot easier to read casually. That might seem crazy to you, but think about it. If I put down a nonfiction for a while and then pick it back up, I'm not gonna go, wait a minute, who are these characters? You can also skim nonfiction in a way that you can't really fiction. If you ever find yourself getting distracted or dozing off or reading a few paragraphs but barely taking in a single sentence when you're reading fiction, it's very easy for you to get lost almost immediately. But nonfiction tends to be a little bit repetitive, so you're not going to be completely derailed if you miss a paragraph or two. Fiction requires very intense focus and for you to read it continuously. I read Dune like a year ago. If I were to pick up the sequel now, I would have absolutely no idea what's going on. Number 4 is the fact that every single thing that happens in nonfiction has more impact because it actually happened. There's no going, oh yeah, right, as if that would happen. Because it did. That's the whole point of the genre. When absurd and ridiculous things happen in fiction, it pulls you out of the narrative. But when those exact same things happen in nonfiction, it pulls you in further. I think this is part of the reason why movies based on real-life events will often feel more impactful. It's why a lot of people have trouble watching the ship sinking scene in Titanic, because they can't just say to themselves, oh, you know, it's just a movie. But it's not just that nonfiction books are more depressing. Every single extreme is heightened when you know what you're reading is true. For example, I recently read this book, Columbine, by Dave Cullen, and there was one section that particularly got me. It was a passage about one of the survivors of Columbine who had lost the ability to walk. And the passage read as follows. He was inconsolable. He wasn't angry at his parents or himself or Eric or Dylan. He was just angry. He wanted his life back. He was never going to get it. That section did not make me cry. I did, however, cry at a section later in the book where we got to see that same character dance at his wedding. Such a simple thing can make you so happy when you know that these are real people's lives. Now, number 5, and this is big for me, is that very rarely will you read a nonfiction that just feels like a worse version of a book that you've already read. This happens to me all the time when I'm reading fiction, particularly sci-fi and fantasy. So many books in that genre just feel like poorly written imitations of better books. Like A Song of Ice and Fire, as much as I hate George R. R. Martin for never finishing the series, ruined so much fantasy for me. Because so much of the genre that has come out since then feels so similar, and it's really difficult for any of them to hold up in comparison to this series that was incredibly foundational to me. Now, why doesn't this happen with nonfiction? Well, it's because it's very unlikely you're going to read the exact same kind of book twice. The thing is, with fiction, you don't really know what's going to happen before you start reading. Fiction summaries are often very vague in order to avoid spoilers, but this will lead you to read books that are very similar to your previous reads. But with nonfiction, you know exactly what you're getting into before you start. I mean, sure, maybe if you read 2 Ben Franklin biographies or 2 books on dog communication back to back, this will happen to you, you, but otherwise, it's a lot less likely that it'll happen to you than it would if you were just reading a single genre in fiction. Now, most importantly, I like nonfiction because I feel better having learned something. We all do. This is why a lot of you probably listen to podcasts, which are essentially just auditory nonfiction.
You and a buddy, you'd grab each other's wiener.
I mean, you might not even like reading that much, but you probably like being well-read. Now, small bonus, if you have ADHD, I find nonfiction actually becomes a lot easier to read because the topic of each book can become your new hyperfixation. Now, if you'd like, here are some nonfiction recommendations to get you going. If you've never read a fiction in your life, I would recommend either Educated by Tara Westover or Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. Both of these books are memoirs, so it'll be easier to transition to from fiction as they're more narrative-based, and both are incredible in a million different ways. And I have yet to recommend either of these books to anyone who did not immediately fall in love with them. If you'd like a book to challenge you, I'd recommend either Evicted by Matthew Desmond or Whipping Girl by Julia Serano. Evicted follows 8 different families in Milwaukee struggling to find housing, and Whipping Girl is written by a trans woman and is about society's aversion to all things feminine. Both of these books will challenge pretty much every single myth that you've learned and every single preconceived notion you've had about either topic your entire life. So if you're looking for something to challenge you in that way, this is where I'd go. If you'd like to read a bunch of different perspectives and opinions on all things relating to the human experience that you maybe haven't thought to pay much attention to, I'd recommend either Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green or We Learn Nothing by Tim Kreider. You've probably heard of John Green. He's very good. Don't really need to say much about him. I want to also shout out this book by Tim Kreider that doesn't get nearly as much attention, but I think is just as brilliant. It is insightful, profound, hilarious, and it contains a manifesto on laziness and why it's important. If you'd like to read something to learn and to better yourself, I'd recommend Algorithms to Live by Brian Christian and Tom Griffiths. This book is all about how we can use mathematical and computer science thinking to lead more productive and more efficient lives. I don't really read a lot of books in the self-help genre, if you can even call this that, because I find a lot of the time they just regurgitate really commonly held wisdom, but the ideas in this book are things that I don't think I would have ever thought of on my own. And if you're a history nerd and you would like to see how history or biographies can be written so beautifully that they look like poetry, I'd recommend either King by Jonathan Eag or Challenger by Adam Higginbotham. Should be pretty obvious what these two books are about. Both of them are definitely commitments, but they will absolutely leave you floored. And if you'd like to read a nonfiction that is just as dramatic and harrowing as your favorite Stephen King novels, I'd recommend The Indifferent Stars Above by Daniel James Brown. This is an incredibly thorough and very detailed account of the Donner Party, and if you know anything about them, you know that this book is not for the faint of heart, but despite all of its brutality, it is still exceedingly beautiful. But yep, those are all the reasons I'd recommend you start reading nonfictions and a couple books to help you get going. Let me know if you have any recommendations yourself for any nonfiction reads. I'm always looking to add a few to my wish list. And I'll see you guys soon.